basic equipment of a horse archer from the period starting round about the 11th century until the end of horse archery. A short open quiver was worn on the right hand side, and a bow case designed to cover half the bow was worn on the left hand side. This is of course for right-handed archers. The problem is that the bow case is quite large, and when you're riding and there's no bow in it to add some mass, it does tend to flap around and generally cause noise and visual distraction. This wasn't a big problem, but it has to be remembered that not every horse archer in an army was able to afford extra weapons and things like that. Strangely enough, the bow case never seemed to have been given an extra strap to stabilise it. There are bow cases with two straps, and they were used round about the end of the Ilkhanate period for maybe 100 years. But they weren't that common. They're seen in paintings. As far as I know, there is no surviving one like that, whereas quite a large number of these quivers have survived, mainly in Eastern European and Turkish collections. This probably means that having the bow case fixed and unable to be turned around was considered a big disadvantage, and after the experiment it was decided not to do that again. It's quite easy to turn the bow case around and have the bow facing forward, or leave it facing back, as was probably most common. However, for many warriors there was a solution to the problem, and we'll show that presently. Quite a large number of warriors had a sword as their secondary equipment. Often in Safavid miniatures it's shown with a cord belt tied on separately from the bow case and quiver belt. And in fact people could be wearing up to 3 belts, because there were also honorific belts that were given to people to show how highly the ruler thought of them. What the sword does is that it supports the bow case to stop it from bouncing around so much. It's like a little strut underneath it. On horseback this is particularly noticeable because the bow case all of a sudden stops flapping around so much. The angle of the sword was determined by the straps, and in fact later types of sword, which were much more curved than this, had a great deal of trouble because they tended to flip over and be carried edge up. This type of sword, which was used almost until the late Safavid period, it doesn't have that problem. It normally hangs edge down. It's not as curved as later Shamshirs in Iran or some of the more extreme kılıçs in Turkey. The angle of the sword is something that could be adjusted depending on the circumstances. Though many of these belts were actually just tied onto the sword. There was no, I've put adjusting straps on these, but that's mainly because I want to try out different angles and see which is the most appropriate. Regularly these sword belts are tied into the rings on the scabbard, and they're just, the belt is a fitting of the scabbard. It's not like a separate thing. In the earlier Ottoman period, a similar kind of system was used. The bows were shorter, so the bow cases were smaller, but they still have that tendency of flapping around. In this case, the quiver is worn a little bit more forward on the waist. When you actually mounted a horse, it would tend to sit back like the other quiver. So an archer had to be able to twist and withdraw arrows without having to look at them. This time the sword is worn at a more horizontal position. This is advantageous when riding a horse because it means that when you're standing in the stirrups, the scabbard is completely above the horse's back and is not likely to hit the horse in the back and distract it. Generally speaking, there's no real problem with the sword getting in the way of the bow. On horseback sometimes you have to do some quite acrobatic things to shoot at various angles, but you still can manoeuvre around the sword without too much trouble. The advantage of these style of quivers and these bow cases is that when you're actually using the sword with the bow and the bow case and the quiver, they're pretty much out of the way, though they could intercept a blow by accident, damaging your bow or your arrows, but in general you're not going to hit them swinging your sword around. So this basically shows that it's a relatively simple system. The bow and the quiver and the bow case are pretty much compatible with wearing a sword, and in fact they actually support each other, as you can see here.